I think one of the darkest and most disturbing chapters of modern American history is everything that happened around conducting the so-called wars on terror. I think to me, it was a wake-up call. I think it was a wake-up call to a lot of Americans in understanding and seeing the military-industrial complex and seeing what the government's capacity is to mislead us into war and to continuously erode basic human freedoms. If I can, allow me to list some of the estimates from the Cost of War project from Brown University, just so we understand the costs of these wars. The post 9/11 wars in Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, Pakistan, and Yemen led to an estimated 900,000 to 940,000 direct deaths and 3.6 to 3.8 million indirect deaths. And the cost in terms of dollars was $8 trillion, with $2.2 trillion on Afghanistan and $2.9 trillion on Iraq and Syria. And the result on every front, as we'll talk about, I think it's fair to say that it did not accomplish its purpose. And in fact, if we even just look at the human toll of the people of Afghanistan, I was also looking at the numbers before the war and after the war. Percent of Afghans facing food insecurity went from 62% to 92%. Percent of children under 5 experiencing acute malnutrition went from 9% to 50%. Percent of Afghans living in poverty went from 80% to 97%. So it was extremely costly for Americans, and it was extremely costly for Afghans. As you do in your book, Enough Already, can you lay out how the full history, the full context of how it is that the American people were misled into this war on terror that was so costly in so many ways?
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you for having me again. It's great to be with you on the show. One important statistic that you could have mentioned from the Cost of War Project as well is 37 million people displaced from their homes, right? And the same group, it was, Lex, I'm telling you, it was like at least 5 years ago. God, it's the future now. It's maybe 7, 8 years ago that they did a study that determined that 30,000 American servicemen have blown their own brains out since then. Well, one way or the other, deliberately crashing their motorcycle or whatever it is. So, talk about the cost of war. That's far beyond, the actual deaths in the war. We had about 4,500 in Iraq and about 2,500 in Afghanistan of just official airmen, Marines, and soldiers on the ground killed, plus contractors and all that.
So that's speaking not just to the things that could be measured, but you can just imagine the scale of suffering that's going on in the veterans' minds.
Yeah. And you know what, too? Like, you would have guessed this, probably right. You probably know more about this subject than me, but there's a New York Times headline, I think yesterday, was, oh my God, or maybe it was the Wall Street Journal. Look at this insane list of the kinds of drugs that all these depressed soldiers get put on. Here's 15 different psychoactive drugs, all to temper the side effects of the others and whatever, where, and then they say that this could lead to suicide because, of course, we know that, right? They even have to say that on TV sometimes, that some of these drugs cause suicidal or homicidal obsessions and this kind of thing. That we know that's one of the side effects. So some percentage of these guys might have made it if the government healthcare system hadn't helped them in the end, is another bitter irony, the whole thing is just, you said we got nothing out of it. I said half in jest, but it is serious, but it's also, it shows by relief what a disaster this is. That the only thing we did get out of it, like literally, was advancements in prosthetic limbs for amputees, whether they lost their limb in war or otherwise. Like, if you want to boil it down, what did anyone get out of this other than, some people got a dividend check from Lockheed or that kind of thing, but that's not to the benefit of the society whatsoever, so that does not count. You want to talk about what society got out of it, what America got out of it? We have better Luke Skywalker hands than before. That's it.
I don't think there's any more clear illustrations of the complete failure of the military-industrial complex. How did this begin? How do we get into this?
Yeah. Well, so I'll try to tell the somewhat fast version, although, Lex, that's a kiss of death every time I say that.
Please.
We'll go through.
Please go the slow version.
Okay. So the slow version is, I'll start with the end of Vietnam. Okay. So one major aspect of the end of Vietnam was that Richard Nixon felt like he had to bribe the military-industrial complex some other way. And so one of the things that he did was he turned to the Shah, Reza Pahlavi in Iran, and asked him to increase arms sales. Now, I guess I could go back. I think everybody knows that the CIA helped with the coup of 1953 to reinstall the Shah, who was the son of the last dictator and had already been in for a while, and they put him back in. And so now this is, and that was in 53. So now this is in the early 70s, 20 years later. And Nixon's saying, hey, what would really help me would be if you would buy a bunch of fighter jets. So I think it's kind of notorious, right, that Iran still has F-4s and F-14s. Well, that's where they got them from, was the Nixon and Ford administration and this push to do that. And the Shah was apparently pretty obsessed with looking very first world with his very fancy first world army that he couldn't really afford. And it helped to destabilize his regime somewhat. And then I don't know the full extent of America turning on him before the revolution, but I know that by the time of the revolution in 1979, he was sick with cancer and very sick. And the Americans secretly knew that. CIA knew that, but it was not public knowledge. It was whatever, stage 4 or whatever, he was doomed. And so they knew the revolution was coming and they were trying to figure out how to handle it. And the revolution was coming anyway. And it wasn't just, there's going to be a change of leadership. When we say revolution here, we mean mobs in the street demanding an end to the old regime in huge numbers, right? A very large scale popular revolution. And they're trying to figure out how to get the handle on it. Some of Carter's critics said what he should have done was had the military just massacre all those people. That'll shut them up. Or you know what I mean? They were trying to figure out what to do. Well, the CIA and the State Department told Jimmy Carter, listen, this Ayatollah Khomeini, he's not so bad. We know this guy. He was part of a group of Shiite clergy who helped to agitate against Mossadegh in 1953. And so we have at least some contact and we think that we can deal with him.
Did they actually believe that?
I think so.
Is this incompetence or malevolence? How does this whole process happen that you go into this process of regime change and keep installing people that are creating more and more instability and destruction in the world, and then you use that to then justify invading and starting wars? How does this happen?
Well, there's a lot of things. And the whole time we're in our discussion here, we'll be talking about a massive conspiracy of interests at play all the time. But and I've never read a bunch of books about this. I probably should at least interview these guys. You'd be interested in this if you don't already know the subject. It's public choice theory. It's kind of a branch of libertarian political economy studies that says that essentially one of its major aspects is that there really is no national interest the way you and I might think of it, sitting here hashing it out across the table. Because what becomes the national interest is the interest of the people in charge of making the decisions for the nation. And so they all ultimately are private choices, aren't they? And the national interest becomes subsumed by what's good for me now. And so telling all my bosses they're all wrong is not good for me now. And on that very basic level, I've read quite a few books just from former insiders like Daniel Ellsberg and other people like that. Ellsberg tells a story of where he's the deputy undersecretary of state for making up nonsense or whatever it is, or defense of state, I believe. And his whole job is making his boss look good, whether he agrees with him or not. And then the hope is that next year he'll be in his boss's position and his boss will move up one. And then his job will be making his boss look good then. And he explains how the truth and reality just gets washed out of this, right? Another famous one, or should be famous, is my friend David Hardy, who wrote the best book about the Waco massacre. He is a great lawyer and he had been a former Interior Department cop. And he said, there's truth and there's falsity, right? That's the world we live in. But in government work, there's our position. And our position takes place on an entirely different plane than truth and falsity. Our position is the thing a bunch of people in a room agreed that they would say and do as they can in committee, come to a consensus. And then a lot of times, once those decisions are made, now to go back on that decision means that you are attempting to disgrace the people who led the decision-making on that thing and say that they were wrong and they shouldn't have done the thing they did. Now they got to do this instead. And so you see just an absolute unwillingness to make change. And this is something that capitalism, ultimately, everybody's got ego problems, but ultimately the boss has to look at an accounting sheet and say, this isn't working. So I'm going to have to swallow my pride or go out of business, right? In government, it's not like that. The worse they do, the better off they are. This is why it was the soldiers in Vietnam called the military itself, the army itself, the self-licking ice cream cone, because it means that they cause chaos, but then chaos is their job, is to go and fix that. And so, and if you're a government bureaucrat getting paid way above the market, then what do you want to do? Go get a job? A great example of this I cite in the book is at the end of the Afghan war, there are multiple military officers, like not too high, but like high enough to be quoted by the news saying, well, now that that's over, we're looking for other things to do. So we're going to pivot to Africa and go find some Islamists there because we are looking for ways to stay globally engaged because, of course, that's their interest to do. Whether that's good for Africa or good for the American people is just, it's kind of a separate question that they're not really dealing with. And so I think that's a huge part of it. I mean, one of the things was William Sullivan said that, well, Khomeini, he's like the Iranian Gandhi. Well, first of all, he's not a pacifist. But second of all, didn't Gandhi kick the British Empire out of India? So what are you saying? You're deliberately putting in a guy who's going to limit your influence there and it's going to declare independence from you. How are you going to handle that? Like, they don't seem to think this through. And I have to say, it's one of the great disappointments of growing up is you find out that the rest of the adults aren't so smart. They're just regular dudes like you. And I think a lot of times State Department people might have very advanced knowledge. It doesn't mean they have very advanced wisdom. You know, there's something else Daniel Ellsberg talks about is when you have access to classified information, then you don't pay any attention to anybody who doesn't. Because what do they know? You know all these things that they couldn't possibly be taking into account. So you immediately close your circle of people who you listen to. And I'll tell you a great example of this from my own experience was I interviewed a CIA analyst, apparently a pretty important executive at one time in the terror war named Cynthia Storer. And I asked her, I forget if it was in the interview or not. I hope I'm not like speaking out of school. I believe it was in the interview that I asked her about, well, I can't remember the exact context, but I asked her about, well, don't you read Patrick Cockburn? And she goes, who's Patrick Cockburn? And I go, who's Patrick Cockburn? Patrick Cockburn is the most important Anglo in Iraq. He's the one who understands all of this stuff more and better than all of y'all. And he writes in The Independent. You can read it for free. Just register with your email address, for God's sake, man. I can't believe. And she's like, who even is that?
So a lack of basic curiosity, rigor of research, understanding the situation.
And she could know a lot of secret things, but without understanding what he understands, she does not understand what she needs to know. I can promise you that much, you know?
I think it's a basic lack of humility. The ego grows, the power grows, then you, to self-preserve, to maintain power, you start deluding yourself in those closed rooms. You start shutting yourself off from the reality of the world.
Mm-hmm.
And then as your own delusion drifts, you're more incentivized to grow that delusion, incentivized to hide, to do secrecy, and then it just goes off.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why I was hoping you could speak to more to Daniel Ellsberg. So the importance of somebody like that. So it sounds like if we think about the machinery of how this happens, it feels like heroic whistleblowers are essential to this process. If we talk about Snowden and Assange, and one of the OGs is Daniel Ellsberg, who, just reading here, was an American military analyst, economist, and renowned whistleblower, best known for leaking the Pentagon Papers in 1971. Can you tell me about who he was and the importance of him?
Oh, yeah. Well, he's an absolutely brilliant guy. I'm proud to say I was a friend, for 10, 15 years there. I don't know, quite a while. So he endorsed my first two books, I'm very proud to say. And he did not have a chance to read Provoked, unfortunately. But I know he would have liked it because we were email buddies. And I know that he thought very much along the same lines as me and John Mearsheimer and others, as people are probably familiar. Well, I think we'll get more to that. But on that issue, he was great. But he was a brilliant genius, and he was a nuclear war planner. That was his second book, was called The Doomsday Machine, Confessions of a Nuclear War Planner. And he had liberated a bunch of documents about nuclear war as well. But he had decided with his quote unquote co-conspirator that they should just focus on Vietnam first. That's the thing that it matters the most right now. And that was the Pentagon Papers. And then all the papers that he had hidden away, he gave them to his brother, and his brother lost them. And so then he decided later, you know what, I remember enough of this stuff that I can go ahead and just write it from memory. And he was so brilliant, dude. I mean, I don't know what his IQ was, but I know his father built the first assembly line for the atom bomb. And they asked him if he would do the same for the H-bomb, and he refused for moral reasons. So that was his background in the first place. And he's just such a great guy, man.
So he's a person who's able to see the situation. Like you mentioned, like that room. And in that room, understand that there's some shit that's wrong that's
Yeah.
going on here,
Yeah.
and to be able to speak up.
And he was at Rand, right? His job was writing, and this was when Rand, I guess, was much more important and very closely tied to the Pentagon. And their whole thing was like writing up game theory, nuclear warfare plans. One of the things he did was he found out, Jack Kennedy had to fight like mad. They had to go back and forth over and over and over to even get the war plan from the Pentagon. And they finally got the war plan from the Pentagon, and it said that if we have a nuclear war with the Soviet Union, we nuke every single city in the Soviet Union and China. So that would be, I don't know if that includes all the Warsaw Pact, but it includes all the republics and China. And the thinking was that if America and the Soviet Union destroy each other and Europe, well, we'll be damned if we're going to leave Earth to those dirty Chi-Coms. So we're going to kill all them too. And that was the thinking in the thing. And it was Ellsberg told Kennedy that. And Kennedy told Ellsberg to make sure and force the Pentagon to rewrite the plan and narrow that thing down. So that's part of the guy's background, where he comes from. I beg people to read it's called Secrets, a memoir of Vietnam and the Pentagon Papers, and then also The Doomsday Machine. And by the way, his first book, Secrets, begins with his first day on the job. I was joking around earlier. He's Deputy Undersecretary of State for whatever it was. I can't remember if it's State or Defense. Maybe it was Defense. It had to have been Defense. Forgive me for before. And then the first thing that happens when he clocks in that day for his job is the thing starts coming across the teletype. Ships attacked in the Tonkin Gulf. And then he's reading, oh, never mind, that was a mistake. And then he sees the president run with it anyway. And now the historian Gareth Porter says that actually McNamara lied to LBJ, and he can prove it. I can't cite all the chapter and verse, but I trust Gareth. He's great. And he says it actually was McNamara lied to LBJ when they knew that it was a mistake.
And the same thing happened again and again. You take a little piece of information and run with them in order to justify war.
That's right.
And that's going to be a theme.
Absolutely.
What was important in the Pentagon Papers? What are some key ideas?
Okay, so the Pentagon Papers, first of all, was, and he wrote this while he was working at Rand, that he had full top secret clearance, and they were commissioned by Secretary of Defense McNamara to write a real secret, top secret history of the Vietnam War and the entire history of our involvement in Indochina since the end of the Second World War. And so that was what they did, was they wrote like eyes only for the Secretary of Defense type material. So it had everything in there. And Ellsberg was in charge of writing it, along with Leslie Gelb, who shut his mouth and went along and later became the chairman of the Council on Foreign Relations and was a good dog, right? But anyway, they were the ones who wrote it together. And Ellsberg was brave enough to liberate the thing, and he tried to leak it to the Senate over and over and over again. Mike Gravel eventually started reading it into the record. And then finally, the New York Times got the courage to start publishing the thing. And it showed that they knew that they couldn't win all along. They knew that the South Vietnamese government could not stand. They did not have popular consent, that the insurgency in the South was not just based on support from the North, but their own indigenous revolution against what they see, as intolerable foreign intervention, and wanted to force us out. And it's funny because McNamara later says that, I guess he didn't read the Pentagon Papers, that no, we were just sure that it was the capitalists versus the communists, like all this stuff about they didn't want to be ruled over foreign white devils. And that never occurred to us, like, come on. As Chomsky said, come on, America invaded South Vietnam. The government that was inviting us to stay was the government that we put in there, or at least after we overthrew the one we didn't like, the one we put in there. No different than, as we're going to talk about, Hamid Karzai inviting us to please stay in Afghanistan. It's like, come on, who's zooming who here? So it showed, and that was the deal. And that was why it was such a big deal, and how he made Nixon's enemies list and all these things, even though it didn't really expose Nixon, it exposed LBJ and the predecessors. But it was a huge shock that they have been lying to us and lying to us and lying to us deliberately, knowing that this is got to be somebody else's problem, right? There's a phone call of LBJ saying to a Republican senator friend of his that I can't be the first president to lose a war. So, right, he's just going to retire first and make it Nixon's problem, right? Same as George W. Bush said, oh, the end of Iraq? Well, that'll just have to be up to other presidents to decide. Not my responsibility. All I did was do it. And that's how they are. And they have, this is also part of the economics of democracy too, where they have and I'm not arguing for the opposite, but I'm just saying the reality is you have such short terms of office, you have very high time preference, right? Instead of like working on long-term projects about what's the future of mankind going to look like 100 years from now, you're looking at a much shorter time horizon, including who's going to finance your next election so that you'll have any say-so whatsoever. And as Yoda and Palpatine agree that like all who have power are afraid to lose it, because what if the other guy had it instead? It would be worse. Everybody knows that, which is of course a huge part of the story of the American empire here,
Well, but fundamentally, that's cowardly, right? So what we want from leaders, from great leaders, is courage, and courage means making difficult decisions that are going to make the world a better place long term, the country a better country long term,
Right.
and that means if you start a war, that means understanding the full cost of that war and how it's going to have to end. And then if you understand the full cost of war, you're not going to start it.